Okay, I've hit the button and people are joining. As you are logging in tonight, your cameras and microphones are off, and that is by design. So if you could please keep them off, we'd appreciate it. I see we have a few more people connecting to audio, and then I'll start going on my spiel. All right, there we go. I think we have most people in. Hello. Good evening. I'm Carrie. I'm from the Anderson's events team. I just want to take a moment to welcome you to our event with Stephanie Wrobel. Thank you all for being here tonight. The Anderson family, believe it or not, has been selling books independently since 1875. And so we've never quite faced anything like we've seen these last 2 years. We just want to let you know that your support of this event by attending tonight and by your purchase of the book through us allows us to remain in business. And we are truly grateful. We're always grateful for your business, but especially right now, we really are. A couple of things about tonight before we get started and get going with the good stuff. As mentioned previously, your cameras and your microphones are off for the duration of the event. And that is because it cuts down on distraction. And then of course, on that dreaded Zoom lag that we have all learned to hate over the last 2 years. So go ahead and keep them off. If you'd like to ask questions though, we will have a Q&A session at the end after the authors are done speaking with each other. So please go ahead and submit questions at any time through the chat. And then I will be collecting those questions. I'll pop back on at the end and I will ask them on your behalf. And we'll get through as many as we can before our time has to end. One more thing, if you ordered a book for tonight, know that you will receive an email when your books are either ready to pick up at the store, or if you have want to have them shipped, we'll send you an email when they're on their way, because we don't want anybody running down to the store, because we have learned the hard way that this can sometimes take us a day or two after an event, because we have actual human beings processing those orders. So that's why we just want you guys to know it could take a day or two. If you have not ordered your book for tonight, or you'd like another signed copy, and copies of Stephanie's book will be signed tonight, I'll be putting info on the chat with a link that you can order through. All right, well, that's all the housekeeping stuff. Let's get going. We are here tonight, of course, with Stephanie Wrobel, who is the international best-selling author of Darling Rose Gold. She grew up in Chicago, yay, but she has been living in the UK for the past 3 years with her husband and dog, Moose Barkwinkle, which is fantastic. She has an MFA from Emerson College and has had short fiction published in the Bellevue Literary Review. Before turning to fiction, she worked as a creative copywriter at various advertising agencies. That's so cool. She is in conversation tonight with Natalie Jenner, who is the author of the international bestseller, The Jane Austen Society, and the forthcoming Bloomsbury Girls, which we are all, by the way, at the bookstore, like very eagerly hoping to get an arc of, which are being translated into 20 different languages worldwide. A former lawyer, career coach, and independent bookshop owner, Natalie lives in Oakville, Ontario with her family and 2 rescue dogs. Welcome, you guys. I am just going to pop off here, but I'm just nearby. I'm just a shout away if you need anything, and I'll see you when it's time for Q&A.
Great.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Carrie. So
here we are.
So Stephanie, I was thrilled when you asked me if I would be part of your launch week. Your book is actually coming out technically tomorrow morning. Is that right?
Yes.
How does it work? Like 9 a.m.? Yeah, there it is. It's so beautifully bright and green. Like, I love the cover. It's really striking.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like I got really lucky with both covers so far. I know, like, sometimes authors aren't, as you know, like crazy about the covers that they are presented with, but especially for my genre, you know, it's a lot of dark blacks, navy blues, deep purples, and just the first one being bright pink and this one being bright green. I feel like it'll hopefully stand out on the shelf. And it's just like a really unique idea too, I think.
Yeah. Well, actually, there's always this moment. Because Carrie's mentioned I used to have a bookstore and I'm obsessed with covers. There's always this moment when you're like, you forget about why the cover, why did they pick this image? Like, you just start reading the book. Then there's always that moment, right, where you like turn the page, you start reading, you go, oh, that's why there's a plate, you know? And I always love that moment. I love when the cover starts to have that other meaning for you, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And I think like with this one, I'll just hold it up again in case people don't know what it looks like. But yeah, it's got its menace, but you know, certainly with the cracked platter and stuff, but it's not, you don't quite know why, other than the crack, you know what I mean? So
exactly.
I think it definitely, well, I hope that it entices readers. I think, you know, when I saw it, I was immediately like, ooh, like that's very intriguing.
Well, give us your elevator pitch about what this book is about. It's I think you can do it. I think you can do it in
Yeah, that's the one.
3 floors. Yeah.
Yeah, the one good thing about like doing lots of interviews, you like get very good at describing your book. So This Might Hurt is about 3 women. It's from all 3 of their points of views, and 2 of them are sisters, Natalie and Kit. And when the book starts, they haven't spoken in 6 months because Kit has been away at this self-improvement retreat on a private island off the coast of Maine called Wisewood. And so the rules there are no contact with anyone in the outside world for 6 months. So she takes off and goes there. Natalie, the older sister, is very skeptical, but lets her go. And so the book starts with Natalie getting an email from a Wisewood account saying, we know the secret that you're keeping from your sister. Do you want to tell her or should we? And so that really gets the ball rolling. Natalie heads to Wisewood to go find her sister, tell her the secret, and hopefully try to bring her home.
Yeah, it's such a good book. It's very dense in the sense of the narrative voices that are taking place. I really loved being in the head of several of the characters, but there was one in particular that I found just so charismatic and intriguing. And when I think about cults and their appeal to us, which is essentially this wellness retreat is really a cult, operating as a cult. I always think there was a year, was it 1996? My New Year's resolution was lose the fear. And then sure enough, a week later, I met my husband on a beach in Cabo San Lucas. And like 26 years later, we're still married. And that's what losing fear did to me. But what have you learned, like in writing this book? What was the impetus to write about this kind of an environment? And also how fear relates to that, or trying to, I guess, comfort ourselves. What was the impetus for this particular storyline?
So I've been fascinated by cults for as long as I can remember, like a ton of people. I think particularly why people join them, why people lead them. And so it started there, wanting to get into the mind of both a member and a leader of a cult. The third outsider perspective came later. And as far as the fear element goes, I didn't want it to be a religious cult. I didn't want it to be a sex cult. I wanted it to be something that when you start reading it, you're like, okay, like, yeah, that those principles make sense. Like some of these rules like make sense. You know what I mean? Because I think from my research, I found that cults, that's like typically how they function. You know, when you join, people aren't immediately like, you're going to be, you know, forced to commit suicide in 3 years or something. Like they start as these social groups or religious groups or whatever. And they start out very reasonable and oftentimes with admirable goals. And so, you know, who in theory, who wouldn't want to pursue fearlessness, who wouldn't want to conquer their fears and, you know, be less obsessive about pain and all these types of things. So I think, I mean, I built the cult, so technically I am its leader, but like, I think at least that a lot of principles, like, yeah, in theory, they make sense, you know, which is what I'm hoping that readers will kind of go along and say, like, it shouldn't immediately be like red flag, you know what I mean? Because I don't think that real cults operate that way either.
No, that's right. I mean, I think that's part of the appeal is always that sense of could this happen to me? Like, could I fall victim to that? I think there's the true crime element, but there's also that, how does this happen to people and could it happen to me? Which is part of, I think when I read your books, there's this underlying sense of how to overcome trauma, I guess, like how to move past trauma, and wellness centers and retreats and all the types of therapies and things that in this scenario in your book that they're preaching basically are about in a way trying to move forward, like become your best self, right?
Yeah.
And that's something I think we definitely can all relate to.
Yeah, I mean, I don't set out to write about trauma or overcoming it, but I think it's just the topics that I'm interested in, such as like Munchausen by proxy or cults, like those things inherently have a lot of trauma involved. You know, it comes more from a place of like, I want to walk around inside the head of someone like I think that I'll never be able to identify with. And like, I think that's a really interesting writing challenge. That's what like really gets me excited to inhabit this person's like mind and body and try to make them relatable or empathetic in some way. Maybe not completely, but at some point be like, I understand where they were coming from in spite of all of the horrible things that they've done.
It's so funny. I think I do the opposite as a writer. I think I start with that they're all a little bit refractions of me. And it's my way of, I think, working through trauma that I've had in my life, especially in the past sort of 5 to 10 years with my husband's health. And I think that my creative subconscious mind gets to, through these other characters, figure it out. And
Mm,
so I'm coming at it very differently. And actually that reminded me about, like, we're both genre writers to an
mm,
extent.
yeah,
And I did not choose historical fiction. It chose me. And I was wondering with you, with the interest in the thriller genre, but also the psychological thriller
yeah.
aspect as well of your writing, how did you kind of get attracted to that or pivot towards that?
Yeah, it's funny. Like, I don't feel like I chose it, but I kind of also don't feel like it chose me. Like, I think, to be honest, I just wanted to write a book about Munchausen by proxy. And I didn't intend for it to be a thriller, but I think that's kind of how it came out because this mother has done all of these horrible things to her daughter. And so, to some extent, wanting to kind of even the score is maybe like one response to that. But it certainly was not a decision when I wrote that as my thesis for my MFA, right? So I was not intending this to be like my first published book. Like sometimes in interviews, people are like, why'd you decide to launch your career with like a book about Munchausen by proxy? And as you know, Natalie, it's nothing so like strategic as that. You're just like, this is what I've written. And finally somebody wants to publish it.
I know.
You know? So, and since then, of course, like once you've written one, then like you do, like the expectation is to continue in that genre. I'm really interested in a lot of genres, but it's just like that first one took off and that was the genre. And it was like not really that intentional of a decision on my part, to be honest. I
Yeah.
mean, I've always loved suspense, but I love other genres just as much too. And I don't know if you feel the same way. Like, have you wanted to only write historical fiction, or do you like also have interest in other?
Oh yeah, like if anything, I think I'm right, just very character driven,
Mm,
large sort of Dickensian canvas with a lot of different people bumping up against each other, and I'm moving them
yeah.
all around like a master, puppet master.
Mm,
And it doesn't really matter to me when the time period is.
mm,
But because I wrote the Jane Austen Society at a time in my life when I had just immersed myself in her, and I wanted to write again after a 10-year break. And I had written 6 or 7 other books, none of which were necessarily historical fiction, but nobody wanted them. And then I wrote this book, and suddenly everyone wanted it. And it's really incredible, like, way that you're just not prepared for.
yeah.
And so then they wanted more of it. And that's the business side of it. But the great thing about being a writer is that you're always finding ways to explore things, regardless of what the genre
Yeah.
bucket says.
Yeah.
Like when I think about what Margarita doesn't write thriller. Margarita Montemore, who wrote Out of Order, her next book's about a magician as well. She's a mutual friend of ours.
Yeah.
I thought it was fascinating that you both had that magic element to
Yeah,
your story
it
and got to write about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But talking about the puppet master thing that, we started to talk about just the fact that you write from an omniscient point of view, which like is kind of on my bucket list of like career goals at some point to do, but I find it so intimidating to just like bounce around from head to head. And then there's also like the authorial presence, like the person narrating it. So I wonder if you've always written from that point of view, if it comes easier to you, or if it's just like in order to inhabit that time frame, you feel like you should. Like, what's the decision there? How
Oh
intentional?
no, I definitely I studied English literature at university, and I tend to read everything before 1960. So I just tend to be reading a lot of books that have a lot of free and direct discourse and that sort of, close interior third person or omniscient point of view. Jane Austen kind of, I think, spearheaded that a little bit at the turn of the 19th century. And she really was one of the first writers to do that sort of fly on the wall and then going down into different heads.
Mm,
And then that was part of the way that she created wit. Now I can think that I'm witty when I write, and I'm not Jane Austen, but there is a really nice way for wit in comedy and writing when there's that disparity between the narrative voice, the character's interior mindset, and what's objectively going on. And someone recently said their favorite character in my book, and there are many, my new book, was the narrator. And I
mm,
thought, oh, they got it, because the
yeah.
narrator is another character.
Yes,
So for
exactly.
me, the more characters, the merrier. But for you, what's incredible is that you do inhabit on this really intimate level these very different people.
Mm.
And when you are, like you said, there's a challenge for you in that. What is the reward for you when you do go into someone that's so different from yourself?
The reward is when, and it's rare, and I'm not going to lie, it didn't happen with This Might Hurt, but it's happened with the third book that I've written a draft of, when the voice feels like it's just somebody, or like it's just coming through you versus you actively trying to craft it. There's no better feeling. It just feels, you almost feel like a reader yourself. It's really hard. I mean, I don't know why I keep writing in first person because I find it hard, because especially if it's multiple narrators, because you want to differentiate between them. And that's actually what I find hardest about writing novels, is creating distinctive voices and voices that feel true to life, and along with the character development and everything. So I think the reward is like, once you've worked on it enough and you get them to sound like them instead of some amalgamation of like me and what I want them to sound like, but it's not natural. When it doesn't sound right, but you don't know how to fix it. And that was like draft after draft after draft with this one. And I think part of that was because of like the three voices. It's like, it's hard enough to do one. And so I don't know what I was thinking going after three, but I was like, I've done two, like surely three won't be that different. But these three like really gave me a run for my money, for sure.
There was something else that we have in common, is we both love Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. And there's something about setting in her books and in certain kinds of books, and very much in this book, and This Might Hurt. The setting is very important. I mean, this is not a spa out in a canyon, in a desert, right? There's a lot of pathetic fallacy and a lot of atmosphere going on. How did you decide on the setting and where it is?
Yeah, I knew I wanted it to be in Maine. I don't know why. From the beginning, I just thought like the stark beauty of Maine, and also like the low population density is just like, because you want somewhere isolated to begin with. I was originally thinking the North Maine woods, like almost on the border with Canada, but I was like, in theory, if somebody wanted to escape, like, it's on land. So if you run far enough, but like not the case, obviously, with an island. And what I feel like in my first book, I didn't focus so much on settings. So I really wanted to make it more of a character this time. And what I thought was interesting to play with was when Natalie goes to the island, it's winter and she feels like she's an outsider. So the weather is almost like another force that she's up against. Whereas when Kit goes to the island, it's summer and she wants to be there. So it's like paradise to her, it's proof that she's meant to be there. And I think that rings true to life, in terms of like how we feel about our surroundings, depending on the time of year it is, how warm it is. So yeah, that just strikes me as very true. Like your feelings about where you are, not physically, but just like where you are emotionally in life, can be so impacted by the weather.
Oh, very much so. I mean, there's a day in January, apparently it was on Twitter. There was this day in January, everybody woke up and everyone was just so sad. And somebody actually said, this is actually infamous. It's like the saddest day of the year.
That's sad.
And I mean, especially where we are, or at least Chicago and Toronto and sort of the like northeastern states as well, and Maine. But when you were writing the book, you had obviously probably an impetus moment or a light bulb moment. Like did you read something? Like for me, I sometimes read a news clipping or I watch a Netflix documentary and something just sort of lights up inside me. Was there a light bulb moment for you about this particular book?
I don't think that there was. Like I keep a sort of just a notebook of really short topics of interest.
Yeah.
And one of them was cult. Just very vague. But like a lot of times I'll end up combining a few of those things. So yeah, it wasn't like, I mean, my interest, I've seen all the documentaries, listened to all the podcasts, read all the, memoirs about cults and survivors and leaders and all of that. So that certainly like continues to pique my interest. But yeah, I can't remember, like, honestly, other than like, okay, this would be a really interesting mindset to inhabit and try to understand. When I write books, I feel like it's a topic I'm so interested in and I want to spend a few months researching it before I do anything. So it kind of just gives me an excuse to like dive so deep into a topip.
Yeah, they say, I think that most book ideas, they start with the idea that you just can't leave alone. You just keep scratching. For me, it's much more serendipitous. I remember another debut author friend of ours who said her agent had said to her, try to worship more at the altar of your own imagination. And I was like, I only worship at the altar of my own imagination. Like that's all I do. Yeah. And so for me, with my upcoming book, for example, there was a misshipment from a bookstore in England that I had ordered a rare book from, and I got a care package instead. This is at the beginning of COVID. And it was for somebody in England, and it came to Canada, and they're like, don't send it back, just keep it. And it was different things, but one of them was the memoir by Daphne du Maurier.
Really?
And yeah, and I remember reading it, and I remember it just sort of settled in me, and she was very present in my mind. And then I had watched a Netflix documentary on Peggy Guggenheim, who's another character in my book, my upcoming book. And they mentioned that she and Samuel Beckett had had this torrid affair in the 30s, and that they'd once been holed up at the Ritz for 4 days and didn't leave the room except to accept a tray of sandwiches. And I remember messaging my agent and going, I need to write a book about that. I was like, how am I going to figure this out? So what I do is I keep news clippings and New Yorker articles, and like I scribble down like just these little moments that I come across, and then like almost like serendipity. So in a similar version of what you do as well, where I kind of collect these moments. You know? Yeah.
I wonder, speaking of Beckett and du Maurier and Guggenheim, how much when you have real people who really lived portrayed in your fiction, how obligated do you feel to stay true to them versus taking creative liberties with them?
I feel, so I'm a former lawyer, so I feel factually very committed. Like I feel like I don't put in anything, like they can't be in London at that time if they were infamously over in China. Like I am very specific about the facts of people's lives, like the publication dates, what they were working on at the time, who their agent was, who their public, like all of that factual part about their life in the context of my story. I make sure it's completely accurate. And I kind of wig everything else. I make everything else up. I try to do a lot of research at the front end.
Yeah.
And I just immerse myself for a week. Like I just read everything I can. I watch documentaries. I watch, YouTube, Google, everything. We're so lucky, even with the pandemic, to have access to all these resources. So I immerse myself until it feels just like another voice in my head. And then I don't look back. And actually, I know another historical fiction writer that's the same way. So we tend to do a lot of research at the beginning and then shut the door on it and then just start writing the story with the characters. And hoping that the research kind of is whispering in our ear a little bit and guiding us, but it's not what is our driving force. But I also research as I go along. So sometimes I hit a wall and I'm like, I need to learn more about X, and I take a week and I just immerse myself in that. But research for me is to supplement the book, which in a way, I guess is probably the same with you, because for you, it's the plot points, right? Like you have a sense of building the tempo to your book. So whatever research you've done is, just to back that up.
Yeah, it's less about getting like the facts right and more about building a psychological template. So it's, I want to know what characteristics a cult leader would typically possess, like what's the commonalities between all the real ones who lived, so that I can give those to mine and then flesh them out and make them my own.
Yeah.
So I actually find having those things as like a starting point kind of helpful, because when you're creating human beings from scratch, it's like they could be anything, which sometimes can be overwhelming. And I wonder do you find, with these real people, and I guess as well as like, your completely fictitious characters, do you find it a handcuff and more challenging to like have these facts you need to abide by? Or do you find it like, okay, I have like this area I can play in, and that like helps me focus?
I think it helps me focus. And I think it keeps me committed to the job at hand and the page, and sort of honoring it and getting it right becomes part of the job, the work part. Because otherwise there's a lot of magic involved with writing, and a lot of serendipity, and a lot of just sort of, again, being open to your imagination, and you can get carried away with it. So for me, I think the former lawyer part of my personality is quite happy to have a bit of an anchor. And some structure, so that's, but yeah, no, it's such a gift that we can spend time learning about things that we're interested in.
Yeah.
And then put them through a blender.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I would say I love the writing parts. Pretty much every part of it, except maybe by the time I get to proofreading, I'm like, oh God, I can't read this again. But like, I would say the research part is like easily up there, along with like, the actual writing part. I love learning about new topics, and especially the ones that I have a list of like probably a dozen things that are just like, have been like fascinations for a long time. So even though I don't know all my future book ideas, like I know that like they will be about these topics inevitably, because they're just like things that I, for some whatever reason, have like always been intrigued by, so.
Exactly.
Who
Yeah.
knows what happens after I run out of those, but it's a long time down the road.
Well, that's one I've noticed is that like thriller writers per se tend to, I feel, have a lot of really great ideas bubbling over. I do feel that way. I know a lot of thriller writers, and they're also some of the nicest people I know. They write about these things that scare the heck out of me. Because as you know, I get easily spooked. But what I love about your writing is that it's really about human psychology and what makes each of us very different from each other, but then also what we have in common, which is really what literature is about, is like you said, is going into someone so different from you and then
Yeah.
being able to build a bridge, which
Yeah.
is what you as a writer are doing.
I think our greatest tools as writers is empathy, like trying to understand somebody else's point of view. I think, in thrillers, certainly there are a lot of villains and evil people, but I'm just like not really interested in having point of view characters who are completely malevolent, because I just don't think most people in real life are that way. Even if they are, they don't think that they're bad. Nobody thinks they're the villain. And I think this in film and TV as well is just like, if you have no empathy for your character, like, why are you writing them? If you're just going to judge them or treat them one-dimensionally or whatever, that's not as interesting to me as like all the shades of gray that people possess.
It's funny because in a way, I guess it's a corollary of acting, because what a lot of actors will express is also trying to find the commonalities and give an emotional depth to a performance based on having had similar experiences or finding a bridge between what they've experienced in life and what the actual character in that script is going through, and finding a way to understand them. And it does make me feel like we get to live a lot of lives, like with you and I, probably between the two of us, have probably created dozens of characters, secondary and
Yeah.
primary.
It's actually something that I've been thinking about lately. It's funny that you bring up actors, because I actually have been thinking there's a lot of similarities between writers and actors. I mean, obviously we hate the spotlight, so that's like a huge
Neuroticism.
yeah. But like in terms of creating a character, it's just instead of embodying them, which I would be so terrible at, but like in terms of just really inhabiting the mind of somebody else, like I had never thought of that in the past. And it's quite an interesting similarity, I think.
Yeah. And it's funny because a lot of my favorite writers, I didn't know this, but often were movie reviewers or wrote screenplays, partly just to make money. But, a John Steinbeck or a William Faulkner or a Graham Greene, some of my absolute favorite writers had a real affinity, for film as a medium. And that's a whole other aspect of what we're talking about, which I find really interesting. In This Might Hurt, between the three narrative voices, which one did come the easiest or was most attractive for you as a writer? Not giving away spoilers.
Yeah, probably Rebecca's was the easiest, because she has the most unique point of view. I think she's the farthest away from who I am.
Yeah.
So yeah, she was probably the easiest and also like the most intriguing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I love that. I love those sections. It was amazing. When do you know you're ready to start writing? Is there a question that you need to at least know to ask yourself? Is there an answer you need to have? For me, I need to know, because I'm a historical fiction writer, apparently, I need to know time period, because then I can picture the kind of people, jobs, the way they look, what they're doing. I need to know setting. Setting is very important for me with my books. And I need to know the stakes. What's the thing that my multiple characters all need, want, or fighting for, etc. And once I figure out the stakes is when I feel most comfortable actually really starting to write, like really aggressively getting in there. Do you have a moment where you kind of know now it's time to start actually writing?
Yeah, it's funny how different ours are, because I'm like those three things, like I'm like
I knew you were going to say that for some reason.
I'm like, that's like step one of 1,000. We've talked before about how you like really, you like need very little to go off of and when you can start, which is amazing. But my process is much more, I do a lot more upfront before I start writing. So it starts with this like topic of interest. And, then I like to have it's sometimes the research is done in tandem with a character. Sometimes the character comes first, but I need to know who the main characters are, like the setting. I mean, I even like down to plotting. I like to have all of that stuff lined up. even though the plots often change with the first two books, certainly they have changed from what I originally plotted. I think it's just a security blanket for me because I could not sit down at the blank page and go, okay, like here's what's going to happen now. You know, I would just sit there like paralyzed. So I'm always impressed. I like, sometimes I'm like, God, it'd be cool to just try it. Just like, cause there is a certain sort of like, not mysticism, but you know, it just like, it feels like
Well,
what
it
people
feels
kind of
like
think
magic.
writing
No,
should feel like. Yeah, exactly. It's like,
no, it feels like
I sit
magic.
down with my coffee and like, yeah, it's never like that.
Yeah,
for
you
me.
can actually, like the first chapter of the Jane Austen Society, if anyone in the audience has happened to read it, it's like you can actually see where I took a tea break when I was writing my first chapter because there's a time ellipse and I literally just started typing. And the first chapter, like nothing is really different from how I wrote it. It just got fleshed out and expanded. So it's like 50% to 60% bigger than the
Mm.
first draft, but the first draft in and of itself never got changed. And the first chapter is exactly how I wrote it. And I just sat down, I did not know what I was going to do. And I just started to type. And I just sort of, again, that's that worshiping at the altar of my own ego and
Yeah.
imagination, which is, oh, I know what I'm doing. I got this. And I just start
Yeah.
typing and it's so
Awesome.
much fun. It's very magical. It feels very
Yeah.
magical, but it's not the same with every book. And that's the thing I would say to people because I'm on my 9th novel now, working on my 9th novel, but only one published. And it's different. It is different between books though in different ways. Sometimes I have an inkling of what the ending will be. If I know the stakes, sometimes I know what the ending will be. Sometimes I have no idea at all who the characters are going to be. So it's actually different from book to book. Is your process at this point, you've just completed sort of your 3rd book, is that right?
Yeah, first draft of the 3rd one. Yeah.
Are you seeing as well a variance between the process between the different books?
I mean, I guess if it feels different to me, but I think if an outsider were examining my process, they would say I'm generally following the same, especially like with first drafts. But I think it really just depends how easily it's coming. I will say like this time, I mean, I still was like plotting stuff ahead of time, but this time, this 3rd one is the first time that I wrote in chronological order instead of in story order, because I didn't know exactly how I wanted everything to interplay. In the past, I've written in chapter order. So like that felt, I mean, to somebody else it'd be like, ooh, like huge change. But to me, it felt very like, I didn't know though the present day plot while I was working on things from like kind of the past. So for me, that felt like very thrilling. And it's like my version of like taking the training wheels off. But I was going to ask, so, you know, you kind of go in and like, just get this first draft out. How much do your plot and characters change from the first draft to subsequent drafts?
Really not much. My characters come to me and when they show up, I just know them. I know everything about them. And it's a very interesting experience. And I know other writers for whom this happens. And they are who they are when they show up and they are that way at the end. What I don't know is what their secrets are. Who they secretly might love in the village or what happened to them during the war. Like the secrets are what I'm going to discover along with the reader. And I remember, I think it was Stephen King that said that if you're not surprised as a writer while you're writing, then how will your reader be? And again, that seems to be more my MO for me. As a writer, I enjoy myself more when I don't know what's going to happen. I really love not knowing. And I have another friend of ours who said that they write the last chapter first. And I was like, oh my God, if I did, I wouldn't even write the book.
You're like, great.
I was like, what's the point? You know? So no, it doesn't change for me. But again, there's no right or wrong way to do this. You know, that's what's so fun about it. And that's why I love talking to other writers because I do also, as I get better at this and more confident, I tend to borrow ideas from other people of what they said worked for them or a different thing they tried. And you know, you absorb it.
Yeah, I definitely, it's sort of a fascination of just like how other writers approach the craft. And yeah, like picking up these little tips. I think I got it from Alexander Chi, like keeping a novel journal with just like both like emotional things like, I'm so frustrated, but also like just trying even more frequently is like trying to work issues out. And like, I don't know why I'm surprised. Like I do my best thinking through writing, like find out what you're thinking, all of that sort of stuff. So like, yeah, keeping these little like novel journals has really helped with working out, whether it's a logic problem, a character problem, whatever. So I'm like constantly just like looking for little tips like that I can steal to like make the process better.
I know that your third book, you're sort of finalizing it, so to speak. Is that right? Like it's done? Is that right?
I'm waiting for editorial feedback.
Okay. All right.
Ask them.
Yeah, that can mean anything. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When with This Might Hurt coming out into the world, and people are going to, I think, be very intrigued and riveted, but is there something that you're hoping that the reader will get that you'd want to share before we take questions? Something specific?
Yeah, there's not really like a message per se. I think it's, again, just it's similar to what I had with Darling Rose Gold, which is that I hope that it makes people kind of re-examine the stereotypes or notions that they held about people who join cults. Cause I think there is like kind of this idea that like, oh, they're naive or foolish. It would never happen to me. Like, but when you actually do the research, like the only commonality I could find between all cult members was they're all searching for something more, whether it's deeper purpose in their lives or, you know, a spiritual something. So, and like who among us hasn't looked for that? You know, we all join different groups and like most of us are lucky and those don't turn out to be cults. But I think just, yeah, greater empathy for people who get like kind of sucked into these sorts of things, because it doesn't start out, you know, when you watch the Netflix documentary, it's like you're watching the downfall of it and it looks insane. And you think like, oh, why would anybody join this? But like, that's not what it looked like at the beginning, you know? So I hope that the book like has people sort of reconsider that notion.
I think that's a really great point. Like we're all at some point in our lives, we're all in a place that vulnerable where that could happen to us, right? It's
Yeah.
part of the human experience. All right. Well, we've got a couple of really great questions from the audience. Thanks, guys. If you could, if you have any more, you can go ahead and keep submitting them. It's just sometimes it's hard for me to go between the two, but I will do my best and we'll get through as many of them as we can. Okay, let's start. Stephanie, during your research on cults, which did you find the most fascinating?
Ooh, that's a hard question. Probably the People's Temple. So there's a book called The Road to Jonestown by, I think, Jeff Gwynne. That's a very comprehensive examination of the People's Temple. There's also a memoir called Seductive Poison by Deborah Layton, who was a survivor of that cult. I really, just the sheer size of it, you know, that 900 people picked up and moved their lives to another country is fascinating to me. Jim Jones himself was like a very interesting character. He helped integrate schools in Indiana, you know, not just schools, like he helped integrate like during the civil rights movement, you know, police stations, all these kinds of things. And so I think, you know, he obviously turned out to do a horrible, horrible thing and many horrible things. But that's what I mean when I talk about like a lot of these places start as very welcoming or positive influences. And so I think that's one example of like Jim Jones was actually like this very gregarious guy who did a lot, you know, was like really respected by a lot of governmental figures and awarded like, you know, different honors and stuff for all of the things that he had done before the People's Temple. So yeah, he's a fascinating figure to examine.
Did you read Sex Cult Nun while you were doing your research?
No,
it came out this fall by Faith Jones, and it's a memoir. She grew up in the family. Like, yeah. So, and it's but like what you're saying is kind of on par with that. Like, it's really interesting when you read it to realize like, wow, this is how it seemed so normal in so many ways. And there were some really great people that got sucked into that and then were able to then recruit like other really great people. And it's fascinating. It really is like a mind bend to read through this stuff. Okay. Stephanie, is anyone who has a sister can relate to the horror of having her in a cult and trying to rescue her and bring her home? When you were writing the book, did you think about any of your own sisters in this situation and the emotions connected to bringing them home from something like this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess less so imagine it is hard to imagine them. They're both very practical people. I have two younger sisters. But certainly, you know, they've, to a much less dramatic degree, there's been times that I've worried about them throughout their lives. And so, and from that point of view, getting into Natalie's head was quite easy at times because I'm the older sister and you do feel a certain sense of protectiveness over them. But I think the reason I was interested in sisters was not necessarily about like the extricating from the cult, but I think it's just such an interesting relationship in terms of how quickly it can vacillate, especially when you're younger. And I guess maybe when you're older, although our relationships are pretty even keeled now, how quickly it can go from best friends to I'm never talking to you again, whatever. And like, maybe that's the case with brothers or other siblings as well, but I only have sisters. So I know that relationship very well. And I just, when I was trying to decide that third perspective, that outsider perspective, that's why I decided to make it a sister. So
adds a really cool layer to the story. That's pretty relatable. Okay, here's another one. Is it difficult to come out of that dark thriller mindset when you've finished writing?
yeah, I get this question a lot. And I think with the first book, I would be like, yeah, I do this, this, and this. But like, I think the honest answer is I don't find it that hard to get into it. And I don't think coming out of it is that hard either. Like, I just think a lot of these sorts of questions are like always on my mind. And I will say, like, my husband thinks that I watch like and read like the darkest things. He's like, how is this not so depressing? But just like all part of the human experience, I guess. So no, I mean, if it has been like a lot of dark, you know, there's certainly like ways to, you know, play with the dog, like watch something funny, whatever. But to be honest, like I would say things like the pandemic had much more of an emotional effect on me than like anything that I've written. I think like the things happening to me in real life feel much more like pressing or whatever than fiction. I can leave that behind. I don't feel it like weighing on me in my, you know, personal time.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the pandemic because that was our next question. And this is really for both of you, is how has the pandemic and, you know, spending more time maybe in your home, I don't know if you did before or after, you know, before the pandemic, but how has that changed your writing process?
So Natalie, you go first.
Oh, you know, it's funny because it hasn't really changed yet. I think again, writing fiction for me is an escape, has always been an escape from more troubling, you know, family, you know, health crises and issues. So whatever's going on out there, when I'm writing, I'm in this wonderful zone, like when you play piano or a musical instrument or you're running up a soccer field, you know, I'm in that zone and the rest of the world disappears. And it's the happiest I ever am is when I'm writing, like by far. And it's this incredible feeling. So the pandemic was just unfortunately one more, I mean, my husband has lung disease, so we really haven't left the house in 2 years, except for, you know, stupid things like medical appointments. So in that respect, writing is a godsend for me, and I'm just so grateful to have it. So nothing about it has changed for me, but I think I have a pretty unusual background heading into the pandemic, you know, for those reasons. Stephanie?
Yeah, I would say actually my answer is pretty similar in that the writing part really didn't change. Like you're still, especially when you have a deadline, you're still getting your butt in the chair every day. And it was like an escape. You could just kind of forget what was going on in the outside world and have your blinders on. For me, it was more of a struggle to like keep my mental health positive and healthy, like just for the rest of, you know, like to be able to come back to the writing chair and like keep performing or writing or whatever. I think that, and that's, you know, how did anybody cope with it? Like that's not exclusive to writers, certainly, but I think that's been the hardest part is just in the non-writing time. Cause like Natalie said, it's like such an escape and you just leave the real world behind. And it is an amazing feeling because, you know, it's just, you're lost, that you're in flow and it's wonderful. But then when you come back out of it, you're like, oh God, the pandemic is still happening. So yeah, that's been the real trick. And if anyone knows the answer to that, I'll happily take it.
I have had a couple authors tell me that they feel like they killed off a lot more characters during writing during COVID than they would have normally. It was like how they coped, and that always made me laugh. But we do commonly get that answer that like actually it didn't change too much except for exactly like for the mental health piece, which of course we're all struggling with in this. So Okay, let's see. Is the theme of your third book, Stephanie, similar to your first two? Or are you allowed to tell us?
I guess in the sense of it's also about a point of view. It's about a recluse who's so this American woman who's been living in a huge manor in the English countryside and hasn't spoken to anyone in 2 years or left her house in 2 years. So it's similar in the sense that I don't know what it's like to be a recluse. I mean, I am introverted, but not quite that bad. So it's inhabiting a point of view that I was like, how can I ever understand this? Like, why would somebody do this? But it's a completely, it's a completely different subject matter. It's a different setting, certainly. It's the first time that I've set a book outside the US. And after living in the UK for close to 6 years, I felt finally like, okay, I know it enough that I feel like I won't do it a total disservice by setting a book there.
Okay. Is that something both of you, like, do you feel like you have to kind of understand the area where you set a book to feel comfortable writing a book in it? Or setting a book in it, I should say.
Natalie?
I tend to set all my books. I mean, Canada is such a young country, and we don't have the sort of local physical history and color that Europe has. So for some reason, I'm always very attracted to setting my books in England, which I go to every year. I was born in England and family and friends there. So when we go for a while as well. But my current book, my third book that I'm working on, is set in Italy, which is, a favorite place, but I've only been to, a handful of times, but I've still been lucky enough to do that. So for me, again, writing seems to be a way to go somewhere enriching and beautiful and historic and meaningful in some way that I don't get in my regular life. And that's, again, my motivation, to be absolutely honest. Yeah.
Okay.
Stephanie?
I think for me, it's less about, I want to get the details of the place right, of course, but that's a lot easier now with Google Maps and just Google in general and going on research trips and things like that. But it's more culturally, I don't want to get it wrong. So like one of my main characters in the third book is a British woman. And so I would not want to portray some, you just want to like get some of, well, not some, hopefully most of that stuff right. So yeah, that's why in the past, my characters have all been American, because it's, even if you put them in different places, like we come from the same background. I think that's also a lot of people's characters are the same ages as them, because it's like, I know what it's like to grow up in the 90s or whatever it was. And so that makes
I've definitely noticed that. Yeah.
It's one thing that's like one less thing to have to be like, oh my God, now I have to pretend I know it. I mean, Natalie does a fantastic job of it, but I'm like, now I have to pretend to know like what it's like to grow up in X decade that I wasn't even alive. Like, I really admire historical fiction writers for that.
Me too. All right. Well, speaking a little bit, we were talking about your third book and what's next. Natalie, I also wanted to give you a chance real quick. Can you give us a quick synopsis of Bloomsbury Girls, which is coming out in May?
Oh, sure. Thank you. Bloomsbury Girls is about a trio of women who are employees of a very old, stodgy, 100-year-old bookshop in Bloomsbury, London, right in 1950, halfway through the last century. And they are in a battle of the sexes with their male managers. There are 5 different men in charge of all these different departments. And the women decide that their only recourse is to basically take over the bookshop. And the book is really about how the heck they're going to do that. And it's got these guest appearances from some of the authors I was talking about earlier, like Daphne du Maurier, Samuel Beckett, George Orwell's widow, Peggy Guggenheim, Ellen Doubleday. So it's just I think it's kind of a bit of a caper. It's a little lighter than my first book, and it's a book about writing as well, and loving writing and being in the zone with writing, and opportunity. And opportunity can be sometimes not apparent to us. And I was a career coach. So one of the things that I was always big on was putting yourself out there and looking for any opportunity to connect with others as just a nice way to live life, and as a good way to create opportunity for yourself. And so after I finished the book, I could look back at it and see this is a book about how to create opportunity for yourself.
And it's so good. I was lucky enough to read an early copy, and it was amazing. It's so bookish, which, and yeah, so to the writing life, and just these women are like so smart and clever, and they're all very different, but they're all wonderful. And it was just like I really loved it. Pre-order it now if you haven't already.
Yes, please pre-order it, 300 cents. I have to tell you, my boss is absolutely gonna love that, because my boss, is Becky Anderson, and the Anderson's Bookshop is set up where we're 4 siblings running the business, because we also have a book fair company, another location, and they used to have a pharmacy that was part of it that kind of split off and went its own way. But 4 siblings, 3 of them brothers, 1 girl, which is my boss, Becky Anderson, and she actually some of her brothers retired, and she just ended up actually buying the company and becoming the sole owner, which it's been really fun to be like checking that box of woman-owned business on everything now. Like, even though the brothers are great, I have nothing against them, of course, none of us do, but it's just been really, she'll just love that. Because you guys know, it's the book world, like any other world, can sometimes be hard on women, so to get ahead. So that's fantastic. I really can't wait to read that. So okay, so we just have a couple minutes left. So I always like to say, or ask you guys if you have read anything lately, and Stephanie just sort of touched on Natalie's new book that may be coming out soon or is recently come out that you are excited about or want to recommend.
Ooh, recently? The book that I most recently read, aside from Natalie's, that I really loved, it didn't come out super recently, but it's a memoir called Stray by Stephanie Danler. And it's the story of her childhood and growing up with 2 parents who have addiction issues and mental health problems. And it's also kind of this like love letter to California. And it's just the prose in it is just gorgeous. And I feel like I've been recommending it to everyone, but yeah, I'm a big fan of her writing. I loved Sweet Bitter as well, which was her first book. That was a novel. And Stray is excellent.
Okay. I will put a link in the chat to Stray, by the way, if anybody wants to see it. There we go. How about you, Natalie?
A great historical fiction book actually that came out, I think just a week or 2 ago, is called The Last Grand Duchess. And it's about Princess Olga and the Romanovs and the last sort of decade or so, but it's done in this incredible way where you don't feel the work of the research that the author Bryn Turnbull has done in it. Like, it's very much feels very alive and fresh, and about this young woman, and a young woman just coming of age, and she just happens to be in one of the most doomed family units of all time. And you can see the train coming, and you're reading this book, and you're reading about her life, and it's working on this really wonderful human level. And yet you absorb the very complex Russian history that was going on at this time, sort of after the kind of the revolution and the loss of the monarchy that was about to happen. It was the emperor. It's an incredible read. And it just, again, came out, like Steph's book's coming out, or just came out, I think, a week ago. So.
Okay. Yep. And then we have it in stock. We have that one in stock. And yeah, it looks like it just came out. So that's really exciting. A good new recommendation, 2 great recommendations. All right, well, with that, I think that our time here is coming to an end. So thank you both so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And we appreciate that you guys over the years have always supported Anderson's and keep coming back. And thank you, of course, to everybody out there again for being here tonight and for supporting Anderson events. We just are incredibly grateful, and we are just so lucky to get to be like your neighborhood bookstore. So good night.
Thank you
Stay
so much
safe out
for
there.
having us.
Of course. Bye, everybody.
Bye.